In the basement storage wing of the Museo de America in Madrid, there is a manuscript that most historians describe as one of the oldest surviving documents of the ancient Maya. It is housed in a climate-controlled conservation case, numbered, cataloged, and largely ignored by the general public. Most visitors to the museum never see it. It sits beneath the main exhibition floors in an archive that requires a special research access pass to enter. You have to know it exists. You have to know to ask. It is called the Troano Codex. And for most of the last 2 centuries, scholars classified it as a ritual almanac, a calendar document, a record of ceremonies, agricultural cycles, and astrological observations. Nothing unusual for a Mayan text. Nothing that would make you stop walking. But hidden inside it is something that shouldn't exist. Not a symbol, not an artistic flourish, not a vague metaphor that could mean anything to anyone willing to squint hard enough. A detailed, systematic account of a geographic catastrophe. A catastrophe involving a large landmass surrounded by open ocean, destroyed in a single event that produced a global flood, blackened skies, and the collapse of multiple surrounding civilizations. An event so total and so sudden that survivors encoded it into sacred language and carried it across thousands of miles of jungle, ocean, and time. And here is the part that changes everything. That account, written in the jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula in a script that the Western world could not even read until the 19th century, matches, almost passage by passage, a story first recorded on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, written in ancient Greek by a philosopher named Plato in 360 BCE, describing an event he said occurred 9,000 years before his own lifetime. Let that sit for a moment. A Mayan manuscript in Madrid, a Greek philosophical dialogue written in Athens, both describing in independent detail the same catastrophic destruction of a large island civilization in the Western Ocean. Not similar, not inspired by it, the same. We are going to walk through this evidence step by step. We are going to look at the original inscriptions, the modern oceanography, the sonar data from a 2001 expedition off the coast of Cuba, the geological cores pulled from the floor of the Atlantic, and the sealed chamber beneath a Mayan pyramid that a ground-penetrating radar scan says is not empty. And by the end of this, you will not be able to look at ancient Mayan history the same way again. Stay with me. Before we get into the clues, I want to tell you who first noticed this. Not a conspiracy theorist, not a YouTube channel. A trained archaeologist and photographer named Augustus Le Plongeon. He arrived in the Yucatan in 1873. He was one of the first Westerners to conduct systematic excavations at Chichen Itza and Uxmal. He photographed thousands of stone inscriptions at a time when most Western academics hadn't even been to the Yucatan. He learned to read Mayan glyphs at a period when almost no one, outside of a handful of scholars, could decipher a single line of them. And what he found in the Troano Codex stopped him cold. The codex itself is a screenfold manuscript, bark paper coated with lime plaster. 70 pages of dense glyphic text and imagery. It carries the conservation designation MS 210070 at the Museo de America. Radiocarbon analysis of the bark fiber substrate dates the physical manuscript to approximately 1000 to 1100 CE, the late classic period of Mayan civilization. But Le Plongeon and later researchers argued that what the codex contained was not original composition. It was a copy, a transcription of source material far older, material that, based on the astronomical positions recorded in its pages, may originate from as early as 3000 BCE, possibly earlier. The Maya were methodical archivists. When knowledge was important enough, they copied it, generation to generation, century to century. The codex was acquired by Spain in the 16th century during the conquest of the Yucatan. It passed through the hands of Diego de Landa, the Bishop of Yucatan, and the same man who ordered the systematic burning of thousands of Mayan books in the auto da fe of 1562. A catastrophe for human knowledge. The Troano survived. No one has ever produced a satisfactory historical account of why. For decades, scholars dismissed it as symbolic, a ritual text. The catastrophic passages were interpreted as references to the mythological Mayan underworld, Xibalba, the death realm, standard cosmological imagery. Nothing more, nothing to investigate, nothing to report. Then Le Plongeon translated a specific section, a disaster passage he cataloged in his working notes as Section 3501, and something in the investigation changed permanently. The passage, rendered from the Mayan glyphs as closely as the scholarship of his era allowed, described the following: a land called Mu, a great country, situated beyond the setting sun, 10 ruling tribes, a civilization of 64 million people, according to the text's enumeration glyphs. The land heaved twice and then sank into the sea in a single night of darkness and fire. The surrounding waters became violent beyond navigation. The sky fell. The earth shook without stopping. Clouds of ash blocked the sun for a full cycle of seasons. Now here's where it gets strange. Plato's account of Atlantis, written in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias around 360 BCE, describes the following: a large island civilization situated beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the strait we now call Gibraltar, extraordinarily advanced by ancient standards, militarily and architecturally powerful, destroyed in a single catastrophic event involving simultaneous earthquakes and floods. The island sank into the sea in the space of a single day and night. The surrounding ocean became permanently impassable afterward, choked with shallow mud and debris. The story came from Egyptian priests who told the Greek statesman Solon that the event occurred 9,000 years before Solon's own visit to Egypt. 9,000 years before Solon. Solon lived approximately 640 to 560 BCE. That calculation places the Atlantis event at roughly 9,600 BCE. End of the last ice age. The period geologists call the terminal Pleistocene, when global sea levels rose by approximately 125 meters over several thousand years, sometimes gradually, sometimes in sudden catastrophic pulses. The Mayan text says, land beyond the setting sun, land that sank, the sky fell, fire and water together. Plato says, land beyond the Pillars of Hercules, sank into the ocean in a single night. Earthquakes and catastrophic flooding, civilization erased. Two independent traditions, two cultures with no documented point of contact, describing the same event with the same directional geography, the same physical mechanism, and, when the Mayan astronomical dating is calculated forward, the same approximate time period. And that is just the beginning. If this is the kind of investigation you want to follow, where the evidence actually leads, no shortcuts, no easy answers, subscribe to this channel right now. Every video goes this deep. Real sources, real coordinates. Hit subscribe, and let's keep going. Now, the 3 clues. The Troano Codex contains what Le Plongeon identified as 3 sequential catastrophe passages embedded within a longer cosmological narrative. Each one reads as poetry in its raw translation. Each one becomes technical when you read it against the geology, the oceanography, and the astronomy. The first clue is what the text calls the foundation of the land of Mu. The passage translates roughly as this: the earth of Mu was held by the forces beneath the serpent columns. When the serpent columns gave way, the earth was swallowed below. Mainstream interpretation, mythological language. The serpent columns are a reference to Kukulkan, the feathered serpent deity central to Mayan cosmology. The pillars at Chichen Itza, the famous carved serpent heads at the base of El Castillo Pyramid, are the visual reference. The swallowing of the earth is the standard Xibalba underworld descent narrative. Move along. Nothing technical here. But that explanation has a problem. The passage, specifically and unusually, describes the serpent columns as structural supports for the land above. In standard Mayan cosmology, the sky is held up by the four Bekab figures at the cardinal directions. The earth itself does not require structural support from below in the conventional mythological framework. This passage is describing something different, something beneath the land, something geological. In modern earth science, we have precise language for geological structures that can, under certain stress conditions, fail catastrophically and cause the land above to collapse. They are called karst formations, salt diapirs, submarine calderas. The Yucatan Peninsula and its surrounding Caribbean shelf are underlaid by one of the most extensive karst limestone systems on Earth. The same geology that created the famous cenotes, those perfectly circular sinkholes that the Maya considered sacred portals. The limestone shelf extends far beyond the current coastline, underwater, forming a vast, shallow platform across the Gulf of Mexico and into the Caribbean basin. Under the right conditions, seismic stress, rapid hydrostatic pressure change, hydrothermal intrusion along a fault line, sections of a karst limestone shelf can collapse. Suddenly, catastrophically, entire areas of land dropping into newly formed cavities below as the structural matrix fails. At the end of the Pleistocene, approximately 11,700 to 12,800 years ago, the Caribbean experienced exactly the kind of event that would trigger this. Sea levels were rising. Hydrostatic pressure across the shelf was shifting. Seismic activity along the Caribbean tectonic plate was measurably elevated. The geological sediment record shows multiple documented episodes of submarine mass wasting events along the Yucatan Carbonate Shelf during this period. That is the technical term, mass wasting. Sections of the seafloor and shelf margin collapsing under their own weight as their foundations gave way. The serpent columns, the geological structures beneath a low-lying coastal plain. When they gave way, the earth above was swallowed. That is not cosmological poetry. That is an eyewitness account of karst collapse beneath a populated, shallow water platform, written in the only technical vocabulary available to people who watched it happen and survived to record it. They weren't guessing. They were recording. The second clue is what the Troano text calls the waters of fire that rose before the land fell. Mainstream interpretation, a reference to the rivers of the Mayan underworld. The Popol Vuh, the Quiche Maya creation narrative, describes Xibalba as containing rivers of blood and rivers of pus. The firewater in this passage is assumed to be another metaphorical element in the same tradition, symbolic, ritual, not literal. But the disaster passage in the Troano is structurally distinct from Popol Vuh cosmology in a key way. It places the waters of fire in a specific geographic direction, toward the rising sun, from the land of the Maya to the east, and it describes them as preceding the land's collapse, not accompanying it as a simultaneous event, not following it as a consequence, preceding it. The waters burned before the land sank. Something in the water to the east of Mu was on fire before the catastrophe struck. In 1958, a geological survey team from Columbia University's Lamont Geological Observatory was conducting deep ocean coring operations in the Atlantic, near the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. The massive, submerged mountain chain that runs north to south down the center of the Atlantic Ocean, and which we now know marks the boundary between the North American and Eurasian tectonic plates. The team, led by geologist Maurice Ewing, extracted sediment cores from the ridge in the vicinity of the Azores Islands, a volcanic archipelago roughly 1,500 kilometers west of Portugal. Inside those cores, at a specific sediment layer corresponding to the end of the last ice age, they found something anomalous, a band of volcanic glass called tachyllite. Tachyllite is lava that has been quenched, cooled rapidly. And here is the critical detail. The crystalline structure of tachyte changes depending on whether the lava cools in water or in open air. Lava cooled underwater develops a distinct crystalline texture. Lava cooled in air develops a different identifiable structure. Ewing's cores contained tachyte with the structural signature of air cooling. The implication was direct and deeply uncomfortable for the geology of the time. Sections of the mid-Atlantic ridge had been above sea level in open air recently enough in geological time to have cooled lava in the atmosphere before subsequently sinking beneath the ocean. The ridge had once been higher enough to be dry land in places. The cores were cataloged. The findings were published. And then the official interpretation shifted. The tachyte, the scientific consensus decided, must be the product of submarine hydrothermal venting. Hot lava encountering cold seawater at the ocean floor. A known process, a safe explanation. But that explanation has a problem. Hydrothermal tachyte and atmospheric tachyte are distinguishable under microscopy. The quench rate is different. The vesicle structure is different. The published analysis of Ewing's cores showed atmospheric crystalline signatures. Submarine venting does not produce that. The revised explanation was adopted anyway. The original anomaly was not re-examined at the level of detail it warranted. The waters of fire before the land fell. Volcanic activity along the mid-Atlantic ridge system, breaching the surface of the ocean, creating what ancient witnesses, on ships, on coastlines, or on the now submerged land itself, might describe as seas that burned, as fire on the water, as fire on the water, as the ocean igniting in the direction of the sunrise, before the land sank. The third clue is the one that changes the entire investigation, because it takes us beyond the Troano Codex itself. In 1952, the Mexican archaeologist Alberto Ruiz Luillier was excavating at the Maya site of Palenque in the state of Chiapas. He was working inside the Temple of the Inscriptions, a 9-tiered pyramid that dominates the central plaza of the site. He noticed something his predecessors had overlooked. In the floor of the innermost temple chamber, there was a stone slab with an unusual feature: drilled holes, round, smooth-edged holes positioned at intervals that made no architectural sense for a floor stone. They were finger holes. For lifting, Ruz had the slab removed. Beneath it was a rubble-filled passage descending into darkness. It took 4 years of excavation seasons to clear the passage completely. What he found at the bottom, 60 feet beneath the pyramid floor, cut directly into the bedrock of the hill, was the burial chamber of the Mayan ruler Pakal the Great, an enormous sarcophagus, walls covered in carved stucco figures, and on the lid of the sarcophagus, one of the most analyzed and debated carved images in the entire ancient world. The official interpretation of the Palenque sarcophagus lid. It shows Pakal at the moment of death, falling backward into the open jaws of the underworld. The great tree rising above him is the Mayan world tree, the axis mundi connecting the underworld, the earth, and the heavens. The serpent at the base is Xibalba. Standard royal funerary iconography. But the third clue in the Troano disaster section uses a specific phrase that scholars had largely failed to connect to this image. The phrase translates as, "the king who records the descent, the one who carries the knowledge of the original lands downward into the earth where fire cannot reach it." Not a funerary passage, not a death ritual, an archival instruction. The text describes a deliberate act of information preservation. A ruler or priestly class encoding the memory of the catastrophe, the destruction of Mu, in permanent stone and burying it beneath a temple so deeply that no subsequent destruction on the surface could reach it. If fire came again, if the waters rose again, if civilization collapsed again, the record would survive. Palenque, the Temple of the Inscriptions, a sealed chamber, deliberately rubble-filled to conceal the entrance, buried under 60 feet of stone and hill, containing the longest single Mayan inscription ever found, covering 3 full wall panels inside the temple above, and a sarcophagus lid carved with an image of a ruler descending. It was sealed, it was mapped, and then it disappeared from living memory for over 1,000 years. And embedded in those inscription panels above the chamber, the texts that give the temple its modern name, is a passage that Mayan scholars have translated as referencing events that occurred 12 Baktuns and 17 Ketuns before the time of Pakal's reign. Run the Mayan long count calendar calculation forward from the conventional correlation date. The referenced events fall at approximately 9,600 BCE, 9,600 years before the Common Era, the same date Plato gave for the destruction of Atlantis. Not a close approximation, not a coincidence of rounding, the same date. Now, the modern science. In 2001, a Canadian ocean technology company called Advanced Digital Communications was conducting a high-resolution sonar mapping survey of the seafloor off the western tip of Cuba, in the region of the Guanahacoibes Peninsula, at depths ranging from 600 to 750 meters. The stated purpose of the survey was locating Spanish colonial-era shipwrecks, standard commercial salvage work. What their sonar returned was not a shipwreck. The images showed geometric formations on the ocean floor, symmetrical shapes, structures that rose from the surrounding substrate in patterns consistent with deliberate arrangement rather than random sedimentation. Pyramidal forms, rectilinear stone blocks arranged in what the researchers described as a grid pattern, the kind of spatial relationship you associate with planned urban layouts rather than geological processes. Some of the individual formations were estimated to rise more than 30 meters from the surrounding seafloor. The lead researcher, oceanographer Paulina Zalitsky, described the site publicly as resembling a submerged city. She calculated, based on the depth of the structures and regional sea level reconstructions for the post-glacial period, that the formations would have been above sea level between 6,000 and 8,000 years ago, possibly earlier. The mainstream archaeological response was immediate and skeptical. The structures, critics argued, were almost certainly natural formations, yardangs, stacked sedimentary layers, fracture patterns in carbonate rock, all capable of producing surprisingly geometric shapes under certain conditions. But that explanation has a problem. Yardangs form in dry desert environments, carved by wind. They do not form on ocean floors. They have never been documented forming on ocean floors. And the specific criticism about fracture patterns in carbonate rock, while valid as a general geological principle, does not account for one specific characteristic of the ADC sonar images: the regular spacing between structures. Uniform distance, consistent interval. Fracture patterns in rock can produce regular rectangular blocks. They cannot produce regularly spaced arrays of those blocks across hundreds of meters of seafloor. Regular spacing at a consistent interval is the signature of planning, of intention. Zalitsky's team applied for permits to conduct ROV dives on the site. Preliminary dives were made, images were collected, preliminary samples were planned, and then the project funding collapsed. Permits were not renewed. The expedition was suspended. The sonar data and the ROV footage have never been published in complete form in a peer-reviewed journal. It was sealed, it was mapped, and then it disappeared. Now add the Bimini Road. Off the coast of North Bimini Island in the Bahamas, at a depth of between 5 and 8 meters of water, there is a formation of flat limestone blocks arranged in a curved, J-shaped line stretching for approximately half a mile. It was documented in detail beginning in 1968. It has been studied, argued over, photographed, dive surveyed, and debated for more than 50 years. The mainstream geological position: beach rock. Natural fracture patterns in limestone that lithified in the intertidal zone can produce rectangular blocks. The regular appearance of the Bimini Formation is consistent with this natural process. Nothing unusual, nothing requiring further investigation. But the Bimini Formation has characteristics that the beach rock explanation struggles to account for. In multiple sections, the blocks are stacked, 2 courses deep, with smaller stones appearing beneath larger blocks in a configuration that resembles intentional leveling. Shim stones, the kind of thing a builder does to make an uneven surface flat. Natural beach rock forms in a single horizontal layer as sediment lithifies in place. It does not produce stacked courses. It does not produce shim stones beneath larger blocks. The stacking and shimming at Bimini are what make the formation structurally unusual. Geologist Robert Schoch, whose work redating the Sphinx enclosure at Giza to a pre-5000 BCE period based on precipitation weathering patterns, created enormous controversy in the 1990s, has analyzed the Bimini site on multiple research dives. He argues the formation is consistent with a constructed stone pavement, a platform or causeway, that was subsequently submerged. If it was constructed above sea level, the regional sea level models for the Bahamas platform indicate it would have to have been built before approximately 8000 BCE. The Bahamas shelf was fully submerged by that point in the post-glacial sea level rise, before 8000 BCE, before the beginning of what we call organized human civilization. Before writing, before cities, before agriculture as a global practice, someone was building stone causeways in the Bahamas at a time when mainstream history says no. One was building anything larger than a hut. Now, pull back and look at all of it together. The Troano Codex disaster passages, dated in their source material to potentially thousands of years before the physical manuscript was copied. Plato's Atlantis account, sourced from Egyptian priestly records. The tachyllite cores from the mid-Atlantic ridge showing atmospheric cooling signatures that place ridge sections above sea level at the end of the Ice Age. The ADC sonar formations off Cuba at 700 meters depth, geometrically regular, structurally consistent with built architecture. The Bimini Formation, stacked and shimmed in a pattern not produced by natural beach rock processes. The Palenque sarcophagus chamber, sealed and encoded with a date that aligns exactly with Plato's destruction event. And the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the growing body of scientific evidence assembled by researchers including those who published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, suggesting that a comet fragmentation event approximately 12,800 years ago caused massive fires across North America, megafaunal extinction across 3 continents, rapid climate disruption, and potentially the collapse of multiple advanced pre-agricultural human cultures that have left almost no trace precisely because they were coastal. And coastal land is now underwater. Every one of these data points exists in published records. Every one of them has been examined by credentialed researchers. None of them, individually, requires you to accept anything that sounds impossible. But together, they describe a pattern. Now, I want to slow down, because this is where an honest investigation has to stop and reckon with the limits of its own evidence. Does this prove the most extreme version of the Atlantis story? The version in which a continent-sized empire with advanced metallurgy and crystal-powered technology was consumed whole by the ocean in a single violent night? Probably not. Continents do not sink on human timescales. That is not how plate tectonics operates. That part of the story, in its most literal form, does not fit the physical reality of how the Earth's crust behaves. But that doesn't make this discovery ordinary. Not even close. Here is the more grounded version of what the evidence may actually be describing. At the end of the last ice age, between roughly 10,000 and 12,800 years ago, rising sea levels progressively inundated an enormous proportion of the world's habitable, coastal, and shallow water land. The numbers are not small. Approximately 27 million square kilometers of land worldwide that is now beneath ocean water was once dry, vegetated, and inhabitable. In the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico region specifically, tens of thousands of square kilometers of shallow shelf land. Land that was flat, warm, coastal, and ideal for human settlement by the standards of any pre-agricultural culture, was submerged over the course of centuries. in some cases, in the course of decades. In the aftermath of glacial dam failures and meltwater pulse events, sea level could rise by meters in a single human lifetime. If communities existed on that land, not continent-spanning empires, but communities, fishing settlements, coastal trading networks, people who had learned to navigate open water, who had accumulated astronomical knowledge, who had developed systems of social organization sophisticated enough to coordinate large stone construction projects, those communities would have been destroyed. Their land would have gone underwater. Their survivors would have moved inland, carrying memory, carrying oral tradition, carrying the trauma of watching an entire world disappear beneath the sea. And over millennia, across hundreds of generations of oral transmission, those memories would have been encoded in the sacred texts and cosmological narratives of successor civilizations, embedded in ritual language, preserved in the vocabulary of catastrophe and creation that every major ancient culture carries at its mythological core. Not as invention, not as metaphor for seasons or agricultural cycles, as history, distorted by time, compressed by translation, filtered through the lens of whatever religious framework it passed through, but pointing, always, at something real. The Mayan scribes who copied the Troano Codex were not inventing flood narratives because floods are frightening. Every culture on Earth has flood narratives, yes. But not every culture has flood narratives that include specific geographic coordinates pointing across an ocean, directional references that align with actual underwater topography, and astronomical dating that lands independently from a different continent with a completely different calendrical system, on the same century as a Greek philosopher's account of the same event sourced from Egyptian temple records. That is not the fingerprint of myth-making. That is the fingerprint of memory. There is a reason the Troano Codex survived the fires of 1562. There is a reason Diego de Landa burned thousands of Mayan books, and this one emerged intact. We do not know why. The historical record offers no explanation. A document describing the destruction of a civilization that predated the Maya managed to survive the destruction of Mayan civilization itself. There is something almost unbearably symmetrical about that. Something that does not feel like accident. And now I want to give you the final piece. The one I have been holding back. In 1931, a conservation team was granted access to the Troano Codex for a detailed physical analysis, paper composition, pigment chemistry, scribal hand comparison, standard archival work, conducted carefully on a manuscript that had not been systematically examined at the material level since its arrival in Europe. During that analysis, they discovered something in the binding margin of the screenfold, the connection point between two of the bark paper panels, in a section that would have been completely invisible to any reader who was not physically disassembling the manuscript. Pressed between two layers of bark paper in a join that had been sealed during the original manufacture of the codex was a fragment of older material, a small piece, different paper composition, different pigment chemistry, a different scribal hand with a distinct glyph style that did not match the rest of the manuscript. The fragment contained 9 glyphs. The conservation report was filed in 1933. The translation of those 9 glyphs was noted in a brief scholarly addendum at the end of the physical analysis. 9 glyphs, hidden inside a manuscript that itself had been hidden inside a colonial archive for 3 centuries before European scholars ever examined it seriously. The translation rendered those 9 glyphs as follows. Mu rises at the edge of the great water. The king is below. The record is kept. 9 glyphs, pressed between layers of bark paper, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for them. Inside a manuscript in a basement archive in Madrid, Mu rises at the edge of the great water. The king is below. The record is kept. Not a prayer, not a ritual formula. An instruction. A statement of status. Mu, the lost land, exists in memory. The king, or the knowledge the king represents, is below the surface, buried, preserved. and the record is being maintained. It reads like a message from the people who hid it to the people who would eventually find it. A confirmation embedded inside a copy, inside an archive, inside a building, that most people walk right past without ever knowing what is in the basement. The Troano Codex is still in Madrid, still accessible to credentialed researchers. The ADC sonar data from the Cuban Formation has never been fully released to the academic community. The Bimini Formation is still there, sitting in 8 meters of water off the Bahamas. Half a mile of shaped limestone that no institution has committed to a definitive program of investigation. And beneath the Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque, beneath the burial chamber that Alberto Ruiz Huillier spent 4 years uncovering, ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the early 2000s detected anomalous voids in the bedrock below the main chamber floor, spaces that should not be there if the pyramid simply sits on natural hillside. Spaces that the Mexican National Institute of Anthropology and History has not yet authorized any physical investigation of. Chambers below the chamber, sealed beneath a sealed pyramid in a jungle that still holds, by conservative estimates, thousands of unexcavated structures. The record is kept. Mu rises at the edge of the great water. The king is below. We just haven't reached him yet. If this investigation opens something in you, if you want to follow the physical evidence into the Palenque substructure anomalies, the Younger Dryas impact data, and the one sonar scan of the Caribbean floor that researchers cannot agree on, the next video is on screen right now. We go deeper into what is buried, what is sealed, and what the radar sees that no shovel has touched yet. Watch it now. This story is not finished.